Thank you everyone for joining my session. It's a great pleasure to be here in Barcelona. My name is Philippe Ozil. I'm a senior developer evangelist at Salesforce. So I do work for Salesforce. My job basically is about supporting community events and also supporting Salesforce events. And I'm especially fond of developers. That's my job, working with developers. So I have a huge background in software engineering, and I'm presenting technical subjects to help developers scale up with Lightning Platform, with everything related to the Salesforce platform. And today I'm going to talk about Lightning Service Components. But before I do so, I have to give you the traditional forward-looking statement. We are a publicly traded company, so do not make any purchasing decisions based on what I'm going to show you. Instead, use only what is available in the product right now to make your purchasing decisions. Now, the good thing is that I'm not going to talk about anything new. I'm going to talk about what is already in the product. I'm going to talk about Lightning, so it's not new. We are going to talk first about what are Lightning Service Components. This is kind of a term that is not documented inside the Lightning Developer Guide, so I'm going to present this concept. And I'm going to present a few of the base service components that are already available in the product. And I'm going to talk about how you can build your own to extend and go beyond these basic functionalities. So what is a Lightning Service Component? A Lightning Service Component is basically something that offers a service like an API. It can be displaying notifications, it can be connecting with a third-party solution to provide integration services, or it can be anything that, that basically renders a service like an API, like managing the rendering of the screen, like modifying tabs, things like that. The idea behind a service is that it's supposed to be generic and reusable. So you do this service and you make sure that you can use it in multiple components or multiple pages so that it doesn't do anything too specific. And finally, what is really important about a service is that it doesn't have a graphical representation of its own when you display it first. If you add this component, it is invisible. It is visible once you try to access methods, APIs that you expose. For example, a notification library would be inserted inside a page, but it's not displaying anything at first. When you call it, it can display toast or pop-ups, but it's not visible on its own, so it doesn't have a graphical representation. It's hidden. So let's see now what are the base service components that are already present in the product. So they're not listed in documentation as service components, but they're all behaving in the same way. Right now, as of Spring 18, we have all of these components which are classified, I would say, as a service component. They have no graphical representation, again, on their own, but they render services that can be reused in a generic manner from across different users. First, we have the Lightning Data Service. So I don't know if some of you in the room have already used it. It's a great way to basically request data from Salesforce without having to write all the complex Apex controllers. So you can fetch data, you can benefit from the cache, and you can also receive data change notifications. When a record changes, you can trigger page refresh based on that. Then there is the notification library. The notification library is great for displaying pop-ups or notice. You have the overlay library, which is kind of the same, but it's more for modal dialogues or for popovers, like tooltips. And then you have some lesser-known library, like the Workspace API, which helps you to manage your tabs. If you have console applications, you can manage tabs and subtabs with the Workspace API. You have the Omnichannel API, which is in beta right now. It's great if you're using the Service Cloud. So if you have agents, you can actually control their work items with the Omnichannel toolkit. And finally, you have the Utility Bar API, which controls the utility bar, as its name implies. So these are all service components. They're in different located in different pages in the documentation, but they all serve the same purpose. They're all service components. And there's actually more of them that are coming up in summer. There will be a few more. I'm not yet able to give you the list because the features are being still reviewed. So we don't know which ones will make it final in summer. But there are more. And basically what I'm saying here is that it's a trend. The list of service components just keeps on increasing. So I figured out I should give a talk about that because it's an architectural trend in terms of Lightning development. Now let's take an example of a base component that does a notification service. So this, what you see here, the screen is a bit small. I should have increased the screenshot. But this is a notice, and this is not just a random error. This is an error message that I displayed on purpose. This is a notice. So it has a modal background. You see that the background is grayed out. You cannot click on the other on the background tiles, and you can only click OK. Now, all of that is generated with a custom, a base service component. And to display a message like that, you need about 10 lines of JavaScript, and I'm going to deep dive now into those lines of code. How does it work? First, you have the calling component. The calling component here is very basic. I just have one button that is visible that says show notice, and then what I did is I added my service component here. So what you see here circled in purple is the service component. So we just added the service component in our page, and we added an Aura ID to identify the service component here, not a flip. Now, on the handler of the click button, we have declared a JavaScript function. When you click, it will trigger this code. And what this does is that first, it retrieves the service component by using the Aura ID, so you do a find. And then it calls an Aura method from this service called showNotice. ShowNotice is one of the methods that is provided by the notification library, and this is what will do the rendering of the component. And then you can just pass the required parameters. For example, here we'd say this is an error message, we give a header, a message, and we can also even do a callback. When you click OK on the error message, this will actually bring up a message saying, look, you close the alert. So with just less than 10 lines of code, you're able to use a service and render custom notification with this component. That's how basically service works. You reuse code and you actually avoid writing always the same code over and over again, because you could write a custom component to do that, but it's already available in the base components. Now that we've seen that, let's have a look at how you can build your own service components. The list is increasing, the list of service components is increasing, but sometimes you have your own use case, which can make it interesting to create your own components. So how do you identify which are the good candidates for a Lightning service component? The first question you want to ask is, can it be reused? Is it a block of code that you can reuse across multiple components or multiple pages? That's a good question to ask, because it will simplify your core pages. You reduce code duplication, and you simplify the code by making it generic. Now, you probably all seen and all written this block of code hundreds of times when you're developing Lightning. This is how you call a server-side action. And then what I just took is I just took the sample that is provided in documentation, and I even trimmed out a bit because I removed the error handling, which actually is very tricky. If you want to do it really properly, you have tens of lines of code to do proper error handling. So this is a very, very good match, because this kind of code you're writing over and over and over again, it's polluting basically all of your components because it's always the same. So server-side action is a great match, and what I'm going to show you now is how you can create a custom server action service. And it's about 100 lines of code, the action service, but you can get rid of those 100 lines of code and just use the service in 10 lines of code. So that's a real time saver. And also with that, you get a real error notification, which is generic. How does it work? So if you want to have a look, I'm contributing here. I'll share the slides so you can try it. Basically, you have, when you want to use this service, a calling component, and which is mapped to a controller. So your Aura controller has an action, my action. It's Aura enabled, so that you can call it from the Lightning component. We don't really care about what this action is doing, but basically what we want to do in this use case is call it. So our calling component has a JavaScript controller and a markup. And to install the server action service and to use it, first we have to inject it in the markup. So we have to have this line of code that declares the service inside our calling component. And we can use then the method that it exposes a call server method, which will do the actual calling. Let's see how this works. So at some point, when you want to call the action service, you'll grab a reference to your action there on the controller. So that means you don't call it, you just get a pointer to the Aura-enabled action. You get this reference, AR, to the action reference, and then you pass it to the method call server. You can then also supply some additional parameters, a callback, things that you can do to process the answer. And then the call server method will actually execute the Aura action, the Aura enabled action. It will deal with the errors, if there are some errors, and then it will call your callbacks on your controller. So this is a great way to reduce code duplication, because you don't have to do the error handling if you don't want to do, and you don't have to use the same lines of doing the callback, enqueuing the action. There's a risk that you forget to enqueue the action. I think we all did that once at least, to forget to call enqueue action. So, and you were wondering, why is it not working? Well, because you forgot enqueue action. So this is typically the kind of thing you don't have to do over and over again. And the service will do that for you. Let's see now with code, because this is just the architecture. Now let's deep dive into the code. So we have the calling component, which is mapped to the myApex controller. And below, I have placed the JavaScript function in the control of the component that will actually call the action service. So what do we do? First, we include the server action service in our markup, and we use an ORID to identify it. Then we retrieve a reference to our service component. So we do a component find server, which maps to the ORID of our component. And then we also get a reference to the action we're going to call. So remember, we called my action. Here we're getting a reference to the Apex or enabled my action. So this is not calling the action yet. It's just getting a reference to it. And then we'll call the service to call the action. So we're passing, first, we're passing the action reference, then some parameters, if you want to have some parameters to call the action server side component. We can also disable the cache if we want it. So that's actually storable or actions. That's a parameter that you can use when you're calling server-side actions. If you want to disable cache or use cache, that's an option. You can flag it. And then you have optional callbacks. If you want to process the response of the call, you can do that. And if you want also to process the errors, you can also do that. Now, what is very good with this service is that if you don't want to handle the errors, if you don't want to write a custom error handler, you can just remove this parameter and it will do automatically for you first the logging in the developer tools in the console. And it will also display some toast messages, notifications inside Lightning Experience so that you don't have to do all of that each time for each error. So it has a lot of options for doing the error handling, and you don't have to copy and paste again the same code to do all of that. Because this is really the tricky part. When you call the action server with custom code, you basically don't cover all possible use cases with errors. So using a service is a really good call because you don't have to worry about covering all possible use cases. It's done for you. Now, I've used this component a lot of time for different projects, so I've improved it a lot, on several occasions. I iterated it a lot. And I think I've got a pretty good coverage in terms of error scenarios. There's a lot of them that happens, and it's not exactly well documented, to be honest. The structure of the errors is not very documented. Sometimes it's just an array. Sometimes it's an array with objects inside. So the structure can be a bit recursive. Having this kind of component to handle the error is a really good thing. So that's how you would use it. It's about, I would say, a bit more than 10 lines of code. And behind the action server is actually more than 100 lines of code. So that's a real time saver, and it also makes your code more robust. Let's see now some general principle about how you can build your own service components. There's a few rules that you need to observe, things that will help you to build the right service component. When you're building it first, you want to avoid inheritance. You don't want to inherit a service component. So if this is the code of your calling component, you don't want to use inheritance. You don't want to use extend my parent component or my service component in this case, because inheritance is limited to one parent class. So if you want to call multiple services in your calling component, you can just not call a single extend parent class. Instead, what you want to do is you want to use composition. Composition, pretty much like in the example we saw before, you want to inject the code of your component, use an ORID, and use this reference to call your service. Because you can have as many as you want. You can have a service component 1, service component 2, service component X, whatever. You can have a lot of them. So it's way better to use composition over inheritance. When you're doing Java or when you're doing other technologies, sometimes it's better to do inheritance. But in this particular case, in Lightning, it's better to do composition. Another best practice. When you want to expose services, you have basically two options. You can use events, which is not the recommended way to do, or you can use method, which is the recommended way to do. Let me give you a bit more information about why it's not a good idea. When you use events, you generally have to use application events, but the risk is that if you have more than one service on the same page, remember that application events in Lightning are actually broadcast to all components on the page. So if you have several components listening for events, there's going to be a confusion between who sends the events and who receives the events. So try to avoid that. If you do want to have events, it can be justified if you're actually sending out application events from notifications from your component. For example, in the past, I've built a service component which does platform event notifications. In that case, you can use a component event that is just broadcast to the parent component of this service. That's perfectly fine, but you're not broadcasting to the entire page. Then for the methods, It's very interesting. I don't know if you already used ORM methods, but it's a great way to expose APIs to your component. Here, we've declared a method called doSomething, and we actually mapped it to a controller function, a JavaScript controller function. And we passed in some parameters, but we also did something very interesting here, which I discovered only recently. We've passed an OR attribute type function. This is the only time in Lightning where you can declare this particular type of attribute. If you try to declare an attribute in a component of type function, it won't work. It's only for method you can pass functions. And this is extremely valuable because you can have callbacks. For example, you try to call something asynchronous, like a server action side service. You don't get the response directly. You have to wait for a couple of minutes, maybe, or seconds, and then only can you have the callback. And having those function attributes is very good because you can pass function to call from your service component back to your parents. So it's something worth remembering it. That's it. It's time for me to conclude. Today I've shown you what Lightning Service components are. You saw some of the examples of the base components. I also show you best practices on how to build your own. You now see that it's an efficient way, hopefully, and safe way to reuse code. You can avoid errors. You can improve them over time. Now it's your turn to build your own and have fun with them. With that, I'd like to thank you for listening, and I will be taking questions. Thanks. If you have any questions, I'm here.
On the notification library?
Yeah.
You had a string that you passed in. Can you actually use a...
Where is it? Let me get back to it. Oops. Here. Yeah.
Yeah. So, perhaps you want more than just, unfortunately, there was a problem updating the level. Could you pass in a component?
Yes. Another component. You can pass in dynamic attributes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, coming back to that, we were wondering the message part of that notification usually gets unescaped. So we can't do, for example, just a line break to make if you have several messages, and we don't want to flood the people with a toast per message. Sometimes we want to display them more properly. Is there any way, because we found everything gets escaped, so the way to add a new line?
So what you can do here, it's just basic text for the notification library, but what you can do is have a modal, and in modal you can inject custom components. So you could prepare your message in an HTML format and do like a bullet point list or something like that, more visual if you have a lot of errors coming up. That's another way to do it. Any other questions? All right, good, thank you.